Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God, back with you with the next video in my series reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Without further ado, returning to The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn as read by Lord Naren White. So they got some paper and a pen, and the king he sat down and twisted his head to one side, and chawed his tongue, and scrawled off something, and then they give the pen to the duke, and then for the first time the duke looked sick, but he took the pen and wrote. So then the lawyer turns to the new old gentleman and says, "You and your brother please write a line or two, and sign your names." The old gentleman wrote, but nobody couldn't read it. The lawyer looked powerful astonished and says, "Well, it beats me," and snaked a lot of old letters out of his pocket, and examined them, and then examined the old man's writing, and then them again, and then says, "These old letters is from Harvey Wilkes, and here's these two handwritings, and anybody can see they didn't write them." The king and the duke looked so old and foolish, I tell you, to see how the lawyer had took them in. "And here's this old gentleman's handwriting, and anybody can tell. Easy enough. He didn't write them, the fact is. The scratches he makes ain't properly writing at all. Now here's some letters from," the new old gentleman says. "If you please, let me explain. Nobody can read my hand but my brother there, so he copies for me. It's his hand you've got there, not mine." "Well," says the lawyer, "this is the state of things. I've got some of William's letters too. So if you'll get him to write a line or so, we can He can't write with his left hand," says the old gentleman. "If he could use his right hand, you would see that he wrote his own letters and mine too. Look at both, please. They're by the same hand." The lawyer done it and says, "I believe it's so, and if it ain't so, there's a heap stronger resemblance than I'd noticed before anyway. Well. I thought we was on the right track of a solution, but it's gone to grass partly. But anyway, one thing is proved, these two ain't either of them Wilkes's," and he wagged his head towards the king and the duke. "Well, what do you think? The mule-headed old fool wouldn't give in then. Indeed he wouldn't. Said it weren't no fair test. Said his brother William was the cussedest joker in the world, and hadn't tried to write. He see William was going to play one of his jokes the minute he put the pen on to paper, and so he warmed up and went warbling right along till he was actually beginning to believe what he saying himself. But pretty soon the new gentleman broke in and says, "I've thought of myself. Is there anybody here that helped to lay out the late Peter Wilkes for burying?" "Yes," says somebody. "Me and Ab Turner done it. We're both here." Then the old man turns towards the king and says, "Perhaps this gentleman can tell me what was tattooed on his breast." Blamed if the king didn't have to brace up mighty quick, or if he'd squished down like a bluff bank that the river has cut under. It took him so sudden, and mind you, it was a thing that was calculated to make most anybody squish to get fetched such a solid one as that one without any notice, because he was going to know what was tattooed on the man. He widened a little. He couldn't help it, and it was mighty still in there, and everybody bending a little forwards and gazing at him. Says I to myself, "Now he'll throw up the sponge. There ain't no more use." Well, did he? A body can't hardly believe it, but he didn't. I reckon he thought he'd keep the thing up till he tired them people out, so they'd thin out, and him and the duke could break loose and get away. Anyway, he sat there, and pretty soon he began to smile and says, "It's a very tough question, and yes, sir, I know that. I tell you what's on his tattooed on his breast. It's a jest, small, thin blue arrow. That's what it is, and if you don't look close, you can't see it. Now, what do you say? Hey!" Well, I never see anything like that old blister for clean out and out cheek. The new gentleman turns brisk towards Ab Turner, and his eye lights up like he judged he'd got the king this time, and says, "There, you've heard what he said. Was there any such mark on Peter Wilkes' breast?" Both of them spoke up and says, "We didn't see no such mark." "Good," says the old gentleman. "Now, what you did see on his breast was a small dim P and a B, which is an initial he dropped when he was young, and a W with dashes between them. So P, B, W." And he marked them that way on a piece of paper. "Come, ain't that what you saw?" Both of them spoke up again and says, "No, we didn't. We never seen any marks at all." Well, everybody was in a state of mind now, and they sings out, "The whole billin' of 'em's frauds. Let's duck 'em. Let's drown 'em. Let's ride 'em on a trail." And everybody was whooping at once, and there was a rattling powwow. But the lawyer, he jumps on the table and yells and says, "Gentlemen, gentlemen, hear me just a word, just a single word, if you please. There's one way yet. Let's go and dig up the corpse and look." That took them. "Hooray!" they all shouted, and was starting right off, but the lawyer and doctor sung out, hold on. Call all these 4 men and the boy, and fetch them along too." "We'll do it," they all shouted, "and if we don't find them marks, we'll lynch the whole gang." I was scared, now I tell you, but there weren't no getting away, you know. They gripped us all and marched us right along, straight for the graveyard, which was a mile and a half down the river, and the whole town at our heels, for we made noise enough, and it was only 9 in the evening. As we went by our house, I wished I hadn't sent Mary Jane out of town, because now if I could tip her with the wink, she'd light out and save me and blow on our deadbeats. Well, we swarmed along down the river road, just carrying on like wildcats. And to make it more scary, the sky was darking up, and the lightning beginning to wink and flitter, and the wind to shiver amongst the leaves. This was the most awful trouble and the most dangersome I ever was in, and I was kinder stunned. Everything was going so different from what I had allowed for, instead of being fixed so I could take my own time if I wanted to, and see all the fun, and have Mary Jane at my back to save me, and set me free when the close fit come. Here was nothing in the world betwixt me and sudden death, but just them tattoo marks if they didn't find them. I couldn't bear to think about it, and yet, somehow, I couldn't think about nothing else. It got darker and darker, and it was a beautiful time to give the crowd the slip, but that big husky had me by the wrist tines, and a body might as well try to give Goliard the slip. He dragged me right along. He was so excited, and I had to run to keep up. When they got there, they swarmed into the graveyard and washed over it like an overflow. And when they got to the grave, they found they had about 100 times as many shovels as they wanted. But nobody hadn't thought to fetch a lantern. But they sailed into digging anyway by the flicker of the lightning, and sent a man to the nearest house 1/2 mile off to borrow one. So they dug and dug like everything, and it got awful dark, and the rain started, and the wind swished and swashed along, and the lightning come briskier and briskier, and the thunder boomed, but them people never took no notice of it. They was so full of this business, and one minute you could see everything and every face in that big crowd, and the shovelfuls of dirt sailing up out of the grave, and the next second the dark wiped it all out, and you couldn't see nothing at all. At last they got out the coffin and begun to unscrew the lid, and then such another crowding and shouldering and shoving as there was to scourge in and get a sight you never see. And in the dark that way it was awful. Hines, he hurt my wrist dreadful pulling and tugging so, and I reckon he clean forgot I was in the world. He was so excited and panting. We'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.